The High Arctic relocation was a series of resettlement of Inuit families by the Canadian government from the 1930s to the 1950s. The goal was to establish Canadian sovereignty in the High Arctic, when borders were still not clearly established. The consequences were devastating for Inuit. Families were taken from their home communities and moved to barren, unfamiliar regions much further north, where they struggled to survive. Inuit way of life in the Arctic started to change in the early 1900s with the spread of the fur trade. Before that, Inuit led a nomadic lifestyle, hunting and fishing. Now, in many parts of the Arctic, Inuit started hunting and trapping with the purpose of selling fur to traders. Inuit were encouraged to live near trading posts and to bring in furs in exchange for goods, including food. For many years, trapping was profitable. In 1914, the price paid for a white fox was $15, and during the 1920s, the price never went below 30. Prices reached their peak in the late 1920s, when a white fox skin was valued at between $50 and $60. When the Great Depression happened, prices fell to $30 in 1930 and continued to fall to $8 in 1934. The situation became very difficult for Inuit, who had become dependent on trapping for a significant part of their living. Income from trapping was always cyclical. The white fox population was on a 4-year cycle, with every fourth year a peak year. When trapping income dropped dramatically, the trappers could not obtain trade goods and store food to which they had become accustomed. Inuit, who had become increasingly dependent on the fur trade, and so on the trading post, would find themselves in need of government relief in bad fur years. The demand for relief increased sharply in the 1930s, particularly in the central and eastern Arctic. Government relief was administered where there was a medical officer, by the medical officer, and where there was a Royal Canadian Mounted Police post, by them. If there was neither a medical officer nor a police post, relief would be administered by the manager of the trading post of the Hudson's Bay Company, since they had a monopoly of trade. Relief amounted to food and clothing, but wherever possible, it was issued in the form of ammunition, so Inuit could hunt for themselves and return to their old ways. That was the reasoning of the government and the trading company. In the background of the collapse of fur prices and increasing relief, the Department of the Interior authorized the establishment by the Hudson's Bay Company of a post at Dundas Harbour on Devon Island in the High Arctic. In 1934, Canadian authorities, working closely with the Hudson's Bay Company, decided to relocate Inuit to the High Arctic. They made a plan to relocate Inuit families from Baffin Island to the uninhabited Devon Island. They thought this would serve two key purposes. During the early 1900s, European and North American governments were actively exploring and staking claims in the Arctic. Canada, which had inherited a vast but sparsely populated northern region, was particularly eager to secure its territories against competing claims. The Soviet Union, Norway, Denmark, and the United States have all, at various times, made claims to this strategically important region. Populating the High Arctic with Inuit who are under Canadian leadership would help demonstrate Canadian sovereignty over remote northern lands. Also, officials argued that by moving Inuit to regions believed to be rich in wildlife, they could return these families to a traditional, self-sufficient lifestyle. Inuit were promised that in their new home, they would have access to abundant game and a way of life closer to that of their ancestors. The approval of the department required the Hudson's Bay Company to assume full responsibility for the welfare of the families. In the event the company closed the post, the company was responsible for returning Inuit to their homes at the company expense or transfer them to such other trapping grounds as the department might designate. In 1934, 52 Inuit from Cape Dorset, Pangnirtung and Pond Inlet on Baffin Island, encouraged by these promises, or in some cases, misled by officials who downplayed the challenges, set out on what they believed would be a temporary move. Their destination was Dundas Harbour on Devon Island, chosen not only for its strategic location as a trading post, but also as a means of staking Canada's claim in the far north. However, the reality that greeted them was nothing like what had been described. Once arrived, the relocated families found themselves in an environment that was unknown to them and unforgiving. Devon Island's climate was extremely harsh, even by Arctic standards. Unlike the more moderate conditions of their former homeland, Devon Island brought extremely low temperatures and long periods of darkness. The landscape offered little of the diverse game, seafood, and forage foods that had sustained them for generations. The promise of abundant hunting grounds turned out to be a cruel illusion. The trading post at Dundas Harbour was ill-equipped for the needs of families suddenly thrust into isolation. With minimal shelter, inadequate supplies, and an environment that provided little means for living, Inuit struggled to adapt and survive. As the months turned into years, it became painfully clear that the relocation was anything but temporary and self-sustaining, which Inuit had been promised. The families endured near starvation and deep isolation. After 2 years of living in these brutal conditions, the trading post was shut down. Some Inuit were allowed or forced to return to their original homes, but for many others the ordeal was only beginning. Instead of settling permanently, many families found themselves shuffled from one Hudson's Bay company post to another in a desperate search for conditions that might resemble what they once knew. In some cases, families were relocated multiple times over the following years, eventually ending up in Taloyoak, leading to the painful separation of relatives and leaving deep emotional and cultural scars that would be felt for generations. During the Second World War, the United States had established a military presence in the Arctic. Amid Cold War and fear of Soviet aggression, the United States heightened its military capabilities in the Arctic, posing a potential threat to Canadian claims to the north. The Department of Resources and Development, which oversaw Inuit affairs at the time, decided to populate parts of the high Arctic once again to establish Canadian presence. In 1952, the Canadian government hosted a conference in Ottawa, attended by government officials as well as representatives of the Hudson's Bay Company, the Catholic and Anglican churches, the United States Embassy, and the National Film Board, to discuss solutions to the declining fur trade that it was feared would leave some Inuit in need of government assistance. There were no Inuit representatives present. Attendees concluded that Inuit should be made to return to their traditional lifestyles, ending their reliance on trading posts or government support. Federal government officials chose Inukjuak from Nunavik as the community to relocate people from. Inukjuak was well established at the time, with a population of around 500, a school, nursing station, Hudson's Bay Company trading store, police post, weather and radio station, and church missions. The area was rich with wildlife. Inuit families had camps near the community where they would hunt, trap, and fish. In 1953, they began recruiting Inuit families for resettlement in the high Arctic, about 2,000 kilometers away. That is more than 1,200 miles. The officers described improved living conditions in the northern locations, as well as abundant wildlife for hunting. They promised housing, supplies, and communication with those who will stay back. The officers misled some individuals to believe that their family members had agreed to the relocation and that they would be given the option to return after a maximum of 2 years in the north. Even if they were unwilling to leave their community, power dynamics between Inuit and the government at the time were such that many Inuit were scared and felt they had no choice but to agree to the relocation. Some Inuit from Pond Inlet were also chosen for the relocation. In total, 92 Inuit were going to be relocated. The C.D. Howe vessel ship sailed northward and arrived in Pond Inlet, on the northern coast of Baffin Island in August, where 3 local families boarded. The Pond Inlet families were meant to assist Inuit from Inukjuak in adapting to high Arctic living conditions. In late August, the ship arrived in Craig Harbour, the site of a police post and trading store on the southern coast of Ellesmere Island, where it joined with another ship, the d'Iberville. The Inukjuak relocatees learned that they would be further divided, with 2 families disembarking at Craig Harbour, accompanied by one Pond Inlet family, and the others would continue to 2 other destinations on board the d'Iberville. This news were devastating for Inuit. Some of them had only agreed to the relocation so that their families would not be divided. Inuit cried at the separation. It is said that even their dogs cried in distress. The d'Iberville returned in September, as ice had blocked the way to Cape Herschel, one of the intended relocation sites. 2 more Inukjuak families and 1 Pond Inlet family disembarked in Craig Harbour, and the remaining passengers were taken to Resolute Bay on Cornwallis Island. The first Inuit camp was located at Grise Fiord, 100 kilometers from Craig Harbour, where the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, or the RCMP, was stationed. The distance was meant to prevent relocated families from relying on outside supplies to survive. The Inuit camp at Resolute Bay on Cornwallis Island was also separated from a military base and weather station. It's important to mention there were some cultural and linguistic differences between Inukjuak and Pond Inlet Inuit. In 1955, 4 more families from Inukjuak and 2 from Pond Inlet were relocated. One Inukjuak family was brought to Craig Harbour, while the other passengers were moved to Resolute. Relocated families found it difficult to adjust to the new surroundings. The conditions in Resolute and Grise Fiord were unlike those they had been accustomed to at home. These were frozen lands, ones that would not become soft like those in Inukjuak. Such conditions were not suitable for building igloos, so the families had to spend their first winter in canvas tents. The RCMP gave them buffalo hides to cover their canvas tents. One of the most challenging issues was the continuous darkness of the high Arctic winter. In Inuktitut, the word for Resolute Bay means place of darkness, a description that was all too real for the relocated families. At this place, night lasts for months in the winter, and sunlight lasts 24 hours a day in the summer. With no other source of fuel accessible to them, Inuit burned seal oil in lamps and wood from packing crates in small, homemade wood stoves. They would melt ice to make water. The relocated Inuit had been promised plentiful game, only to learn that the nearby caribou and muskox populations were depleted. The families were told upon arrival that they would be allowed only 1 caribou per family and that they would be fined $500 or arrested if they were caught hunting muskox. Back at Inukjuak, they had nearly 50 varieties of wildlife that they hunted, fished, and gathered, including game, mussels and clams, duck and geese, and berries in the summer. The relocated families had to adjust their diet to available game, which were mostly seal and polar bear. Despite the help they received from Pond Inlet families in adapting to local conditions, the relocated Inuit struggled to find food. The lack of food left them starving at times, with a sudden change of diet and extreme weather conditions taking a toll on their physical and mental health. With little to eat, some Inuit took to scavenging food scraps from the dump by the military base in Resolute. When they were caught, the RCMP searched their tents and confiscated the scavenged food. Because of little rain and no lakes, there was no sources of fresh water available, so they had to melt snow to make water. Inuit had no contact with their relatives back home. The government withheld their letters. Depression set in as the families began to realize that they would not be permitted to return home after 2 years. In response to RCMP reports that Inuit had asked to return, government officials stated that families would have to finance their own return to their original settlements. Some were only able to leave the high Arctic when they were sent south for treatment against tuberculosis. Some Inuit said their dogs were shot by the RCMP. Dogs were a crucial part of Inuit lifestyle, used as companions and for hunting. Inuit were acting as guides and helped with mapping and data collection for government officials. Man hunted polar bears and foxes while women would work on skins. Those were taken by the RCMP, and Inuit were never compensated or paid for their work. Eventually, Inuit learned the local beluga whale migration routes and were able to hunt them, hunting over a range of 18,000 square kilometers. That's almost 7,000 square miles. In the 1960s, houses and a school were built at Grise Fiord, and the RCMP post was moved near Inuit settlement. On the other side, the settlement at Resolute became more established. There also was an RCMP post set up, and houses and a school were built. Some Inuit men were employed at the base. A bar opened, allowing Inuit and non-Inuit to mix. Still not accustomed to the extreme cold of the high Arctic, the Resolute bar became a popular spot for locals. In later interviews, some Inuit said alcohol became the only way to tolerate the living conditions. Increased alcohol consumption led to cases of domestic violence, which in turn affected the children of these relocated adults. In the 1970s, the bar was shut down. During the 1970s and 1980s, many relocated Inuit were permitted to return to their respective home communities, paying on their own. During the 1980s, the relocated Inuit and their descendants initiated a claim against the Canadian government, arguing that there is overwhelming evidence to suggest that the central, if not the sole reasons, for the relocation of Inuit to the high Arctic was the desire by Canada to assert its sovereignty over the Arctic islands and surrounding area. In 1988, the federal government acknowledged that it was responsible for returning Inuit and began paying for their return to Inukjuak, either permanently or for a visit. As young people born in the high Arctic saw it as their home, many decided to stay there. Families were once again painfully divided, as some opted to stay in the high Arctic and others chose to leave. In 1996, the federal government established a reconciliation agreement with a $10 million fund for relocated Inuit who could only access the money if they acknowledged that the government had acted honorably and would be paid this money yearly. Nevertheless, later they paid them. John Duncan, then Federal Minister of Indian Affairs and Northern Development, delivered an official apology in 2010 and commended the relocated Inuit for establishing a Canadian presence in the high Arctic. That same year, monuments were unveiled to the relocated families in Grise Fiord and Resolute. The communities in Grise Fiord and Resolute remain active today, with about 150 people living in Grise Fiord and about 190 in Resolute.